All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this informational webinar on the application process and cohort experience for the Bridges Collaborative, which is a new initiative out of the Century Foundation that is seeking to bring together 50 partners from across the country to work on the all-important issue of school diversity and integration. We're so excited to have you here today, and we hope that you'll gain some useful information about the Bridges Collaborative today, and that we'll be able to walk you through the application process. And most importantly, that we'll be able to answer any questions that you may have at the end of this session. So we'll be sure to leave room for questions. My name is Stefan Lounger. I'm the director of the Bridges Collaborative here at the Century Foundation. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and my connection to this issue. I always start by talking about my own personal connection, and that is my family's history in relation to school integration and my own personal history. So my grandfather was a lawyer in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And so growing up, I always heard stories about my grandfather and specifically learned about Brown versus Board of Education and had this assumption that I think many Americans have, that the issue of school segregation was a settled issue. It was an issue that was in the past, and we didn't really have to worry about it anymore because it had been solved. And nothing could have been further from the truth. So, as a young kid growing up in public schools in North Carolina, my lived experience really bore out the fact that Brown v. Board was not a solved issue. It didn't settle the case, and that we have a lot of work to do. My experience in particular in high school was that I attended a pretty diverse school, but within the school, because of systems of tracking and who got selected for AP classes, really internally my school was quite segregated. And as I talk to folks in this generation and other generations, many folks across this country have had a similar experience, and too many of our children today continue to have the same experience. I decided to get into education for this very reason. I was a school leader in New Orleans and worked at the same school for 10 years, Langston Hughes Academy in New Orleans, and was confused after a decade of a renewed and rebuilt school system as to why we still existed in a segregated school system, despite the fact that students had the opportunity to go to school wherever they wanted in the city. So I went to grad school to study the issue a little bit more deeply, and had the opportunity to really dive in. And as part of my experience, spent a year in the New York City Department of Education working under Chancellor Richard Carranza, listening, learning, talking to folks in all 5 boroughs of New York City about this issue, and working on it. And that has led me here to the Century Foundation, where I'm excited to be the director of this new initiative, where as a result of all of the conversations that I've been able to have and my colleagues have had across the country, we're excited to answer the call for folks who are willing to and excited to push the envelope and make sure that the future for our kids is a diverse future, an integrated future, and a rigorous future. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're hoping to accomplish today. I'm going to start by reviewing the goals of the Bridges Collaborative cohort. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk to you about what we anticipate the cohort experience being like. I'm going to walk through the application process, which is luckily not too complicated. And then we're going to spend at least 20 minutes at the end answering your questions about the Bridges Collaborative, about the experience, and about the application process. Now, I'm a teacher, so I know how to talk, but I'm going to make sure I discipline myself, and I have colleagues here on this end who are going to help push me along and tell me to shut up when it's time to answer questions, because I do think the most important part of this experience today is to make sure we get to some of the questions that you have. Let's start, however, by talking about why this issue is so important. So as I alluded to in the introduction, this is an issue that unfortunately has not been settled. And in many cases, our schools are more segregated along lines of race and class than they've been any time in the last 50 years, which should be deeply unsettling to anybody. Specifically, let's talk some numbers here. There was a study done 4 years ago that found that about a fifth of our public schools in this country have almost no white students in them. That is to say that 90% of their students are either Black or Latino, and then another fifth of our schools, of the schools in our country, public schools, have no students of color. And so when you take that together, 2/5 of our schools in this country are highly segregated, and that's in the year 2020. This research was done in 2016, but the needle has not moved dramatically on that issue since. So we're still facing the same numbers. So why is this issue so important? Um, a second reason is it's not just about race. The trends for economic segregation are becoming worse by the year as well. So just in the last 30 years, segregation within school districts has increased by 10%. Segregation between school districts has increased by 20%. So we see this phenomenon where low-income school districts are becoming poorer and getting less resources, and wealthier school districts are trending in the opposite direction. And then this is perhaps the most staggering of all. Within our largest 100 school districts in this country, which make up a disproportionate share of all of our public students, economic segregation within them has increased by 30%, meaning we've got schools within our large school districts, schools on one side of the district that serve primarily low-income population, and schools on the other side of the district that do just the opposite. And then finally, and I think this goes without saying, for anyone who hasn't been hiding under a rock for the last month and a half, there's been an awakening in this country, another awakening on the legacy of racial injustice, particularly perpetrated against African Americans, but injustices that really stem from a society that for too long has tried to keep people separate and has tried to prevent folks from pursuing a future of equality where folks get to play on the same field. And so the thing that we want to highlight here at the Century Foundation is a lot of the conversations that have been happening in the last month and a half have been extremely constructive. They've been very positive, and folks have made promises of fighting for systemic changes. But too few of those conversations have focused on the education system. And one of the main arguments that we make that we think is pretty indisputable is that we're not going to solve this issue unless we start with our classrooms. This, reform in criminal justice is extremely important, and we're excited to see that move along, and we're excited to see real reforms happen in the coming months and years. Economic reforms, extremely important. We're excited to see that happen as well. But as Chief Justice Thurgood Marshall famously said, until our children learn to live together, there's little hope that our people will learn to live together. Until our children learn together, there's little hope that our people will learn to live together. So school segregation is at the heart of the issue, and anybody who says that they are for systemic change but is not willing to push on this issue is not pushing hard enough. Finally, after decades of research, and we would know because the Century Foundation has been at the forefront of research on school integration for the last few decades, school integration by race and class works. It has a myriad of benefits that are conferred not just to low-income students, which is a common misconception, but students of all backgrounds, all races, all economic statuses. And that's a really key point here. Is the fact is we've learned a lot in the last few decades. And for folks who have the 1960s and 1970s as a frame of reference and the desegregation that we attempted in those decades, that is not quite what we're talking about. We're talking about something different. We're talking about a future for children that is diverse, integrated, rigorous, brings people to the table, inclusive of all ideas. And that is not something that we saw in large swaths of the country in earlier eras. So this is where the Bridges Collaborative comes in. Our vision is an America where every child has the opportunity to attend a school that is diverse, integrated, rigorous, and inclusive. And all of those adjectives are important, as I just stated. It's not enough just to bring all of the students from different backgrounds around the same table and bring them into the same building. We know that the other half of the equation is maybe even the more crucial equation, which is what happens once all of those children are in the same school building. And then our mission, and this is important to the conversation we're having today, because this cohort that we are launching is the centerpiece of what we see is needed to achieve our mission. So our goal is to dramatically increase the number of students who attend diverse, integrated, rigorous, and inclusive schools. And we do that through three ways. One is by bringing folks together. So just like this, through this cohort in the collaborative, we're going to bring 50 folks from across the country. And we are going to not just randomly bring folks together, and we're not bringing folks together just to do an academic exercise. We are bringing practitioners together, folks who are on the ground, who are working on this issue in large districts and small districts, urban, suburban, and we're bringing them together to collaborate in really smart ways. The fact of the matter is there are folks across the country who figured out different pieces to this equation. Nobody's really figured out the whole thing. And if we can bring together folks in ways that are smart and allow them to collaborate in ways that amplify people's strengths and allow them to learn from one another, that's some of the most powerful learning that can happen. Secondly, we here at the Century Foundation, by virtue of having studied this issue for many decades, and also by virtue of some of our partners in the field who are doing ongoing cutting edge research on this issue, have a wealth of knowledge that hasn't always been disseminated to the field in ways that are useful to practitioners. And so the second key lever that we see here is making sure that valuable information, useful information, information around messaging, how do we as leaders talk about this issue in our communities in ways that are compelling? How do we actually change the political environment to be accepting of some of the things that we're hoping to do? And then finally, influencing the national dialogue on school integration. You know, school integration was a cornerstone of the platform of the civil rights movement. And for many reasons, in large part because of the failures of our country to do this properly in the 60s and 70s, has been largely abandoned and out of the popular eye. And if it has been, it's usually been with negative connotations. But we're arguing that this is a new era and this is a new day, and that integration in 2020 has a lot of potential and that everyone should get behind it. In order to do that, we need to be part of a collective national dialogue on this issue. And so one of the things we're most excited to do is to tap those members who are excited to be part of a conversation even bigger than their own community to participate in a national dialogue and bringing this issue back to the fore in the coming months and coming years. So let's talk some nuts and bolts here about the cohort. And this is where I think we'll get the bulk of the questions. I'm excited to see what you all are interested to ask. But I'm going to give, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give some basic information about who we're looking for, what the process is going to be like, and what the experience will be like. So very specifically, and I think this is important to start, we're looking for 3 types of organizations. Or membership in this collaborative is by organization, and then each organization will send a mini team of 2 to 5 individuals. And the organizations we're looking for first are school districts, charter schools or charter management organizations, and housing organizations. Now, the question often gets asked, now, why are you bringing these 3 sets of organizations to the table? Well, the truth of the matter is, for us, what's most important is that we have partners who are focused on this issue of making more of our schools diverse, integrated, and inclusive and rigorous. And there are things to learn in all of the sectors. And in fact, we think the learning is more powerful when we bring people together. So we're not interested in having any of the debates about charter versus traditional public school versus anything else. To be quite honest, we're interested in bringing people together who care about this issue and who want to learn from one another. And we think there are important things to be learned across all of these organizations. Now, what that does mean is for organizations that don't fit into one of these categories, unfortunately, you would not be eligible to apply for the Bridges Collaborative cohort because we're specifically focusing on these 3 organizations. However, I've gotten a lot of outreach from interested parties. Either these are individuals who are not affiliated with an organization or an organization that does not fit neatly into one of these 3 categories. And I want to make sure you know that there are going to be ways for you to plug in. We really see this as a national effort that we're going to need everyone to play a role in. And so later in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about other ways for folks who may not be eligible to be part of the cohort itself, but to still be able to plug in. And then for housing organizations, we think it's so important for folks in the housing sector and in the education sector to be collaborating on this issue. For too long, good folks have been putting their heads down and just thinking about what it is that they can influence in their own sector. But real meaningful, long-term sustainable progress is going to require work from across both sectors. So public school districts and public charter schools are eligible to apply And so that's an important parameter there for folks to keep in mind. And then for housing organizations, the parameters are a little bit broader because there are so many different types of housing organizations. So organizations such as those that support people with affordable housing, housing vouchers, mobility programs, whether these are housing authorities, local housing authorities, or they're nonprofits. But any housing organization that's committed to the goal of diverse, integrated, and inclusive communities and schools is eligible to apply. If you have any specific questions about your own organization, feel free to reach out to me directly, and we can talk about eligibility there. And then for the folks within the organization, so again, we're looking for 2 to 5 leaders within each organization. Organizations have the latitude to designate who their team is and how big it is within that 2 to 5 parameter. But there are a couple of stipulations, and one is that one of the members should be the head of the organization. So this is the CEO or the superintendent. For some of our largest partners, this is more likely to actually be a cabinet level member. So we can also reach out and have conversations for some of our largest organizations where it may not be realistic for a CEO or superintendent to be present at all of the events. And then one member should be the most senior person in the organization who deals directly with school integration and diversity initiatives. The other 3 members, up to 3 members, are completely open for the organization to choose, and they could even be partners, organization partners who aren't folks who are full-time employees of those specific organizations. Very quickly, what is the cost? So we are lucky to have funding for this cohort, which makes membership in the collaborative free of cost to those that are accepted into the collaborative. And there are a number of financial benefits. We are first and foremost able to provide some modest stipends for travel and accommodations to national convenings. They're likely to cover the cost for 2 participants per organization. As you can see in some of the fine print here, COVID has thrown all of us for a loop. And so our plans obviously have changed and will continue to change. And so funding may potentially increase depending on the number of actual in-person convenings that we're going to have. The first convening will be a virtual affair. And then finally, of course, there's access to cutting edge professional development, which includes PD on equity and anti-racism, consultancies, access to research. All of those are also part of the cohort experience, and those are provided free of cost. And then just again, a note that for larger teams, there is the possibility, depending on the structure of in-person convenings, that additional members attending may need to be subsidized. So the application process is pretty straightforward, and we are targeting practitioners, folks who are in the field doing the work, and so we really did our very best not to make the application process too onerous. That being said, there's some very important information we need in order to figure out who is going to be a part of this cohort. So we ask that everyone take the application process seriously. You can access the application process from the Bridges Collaborative website. There's a link there. You will also find a link here, right here on the PowerPoint presentation, and it will be emailed to all participants of this webinar right after the webinar. The due date will be Friday, August 7th at midnight Pacific Standard Time. And then we're going to get into this in a second, but as far as what information you should have on hand as you're doing the application, there's going to be some basic demographic questions that are asked about the organization that's applying. We're going to ask what the state of segregation is in your particular organization or your community. What does it look like there? Is it along lines of race? Is it along lines of class or other lines, disability? So we want to know about that. We want to know what integration initiatives you may already have been involved in as an organization. And then finally, we are also asking for a frank assessment of what your strengths and weaknesses are as an organization relative to some of the areas that we're going to be targeting as a collaborative, which I'll get into more in a second. And then finally, here's a tip. Be sure to download the Word doc version of the application before you complete it. We've estimated it'll take about 1 to 2 hours to do the application. The online application does not have a save feature, and so you're going to need to complete it in one sitting. But rather than putting all that pressure on you, we think it would be easier for the purposes of brainstorming, planning, thinking, and drafting your work to download the Word doc version, which is available at the top of the application. The simple click, you'll be able to download it, and then to return and copy and paste your answers into the application once you're ready to submit, just to make sure that none of your precious work gets lost. Okay, so a word about the selection process. Number one thing, we are really interested in getting a wide diversity of folks who are all across the spectrum in terms of geography, in terms of size, experience, and working on this issue, so forth and so on. So the primary criteria that we're actually looking for here is a commitment to this issue moving forward. Is your organization, is your school district, is your school, is your housing organization, are you committed to this issue? And are you committed to, over the next 2 years, not just collaborating with folks from across the country, but making real and significant progress on this issue in your own community? And I'm going to leave that a little bit vague because progress looks very different in different places. For communities that have been working on this for decades, progress may look like really focusing on culturally responsive curriculum in the classroom and making sure that we are meeting the needs of all of our students. For folks who are just beginning this work, it may look like getting the political environment right in order to be able to move some of the make some of the changes that need to be made in order to get diverse environments for students. So at the end of the day, what we're looking for is we want to assemble a cohort. And so our selection process is going to pay very close attention to the fine details in the application, so that when we are assembling the cohort, we're assembling a cohort that makes sense in terms of how we can get folks to collaborate with one another and maximize the strengths and areas for growth that exist in the collective cohort. So what does the experience look like? I'm going to spend just a little bit of time here, but I really do want to make sure I get to your question. So I'm coming up on my 2-minute warning here. So let me very briefly just say, it is a 2-year experience that 2 to 5 members of your organization are going to go through together. It has been designed to be something that is accessible to practitioners. So we're not looking to command tons and tons of people's time, but we do have high expectations for participation, so that when we do have events and we do have opportunities, that we expect our members to take full advantage of them. There are going to be 3 national convenings over the 2 years. The first has already been established and designated as a virtual convening for safety reasons. It's going to take place in mid-October, so please hold the dates October 15th and 16th in your calendars now. More details will come to those organizations who've been accepted as members. And then in between, there's going to be interim programming. So there will be virtual sessions, there will be consultancies, there will be regional convenings for some of our members, depending on where members are located. And then, of course, as I alluded to earlier, there's access to some of this incredible messaging research that we've been commissioning as the Century Foundation on how we convince folks about school integration and school diversity. One thing that's really important to us is that this is extremely useful to all of the folks who decide to sign up. And so our learning experiences are going to be differentiated by role at times, by geography at times, and by experience. So it's not a one size fits all. We're looking to really customize the experience to meet the needs of the member organizations. And then, of course, a huge draw is this potential for cross-sector collaboration. We're very excited about bringing together housing and education partners and making sure we learn key lessons to be able to push the work forward. And then finally, for those that are interested, there'll be opportunities to plug into the national conversation. And we see this as a growing debate over the coming years that we're excited to participate in. So for those who've already opened the application, you'll notice on one part of the application, although it looks like a lot of text, it's not tons of work for you. We're asking you to consider what your relative strengths are as an organization in relation to the myriad of issues that we have to think about when we're thinking about creating diverse, integrated, rigorous, and inclusive schools. And so I'm clearly not going to sit here and read these issues to you, but I wanted to just highlight a couple of things. And these come from conversations that we've been having over the last few months with prospective members and practitioners from across the country. These are things that folks have said, I'm really interested in working and collaborating with folks on this particular issue. So we want to know, as you're applying, what will we be able to tap you for areas that you may have a lot of expertise in, and what are the areas that you want to make sure you're able to collaborate with other folks on? So for example, in some of these broad categories, I'm just going to call out one from each one. So for stakeholder engagement, we talk with tons of folks from across the country who say, we just need help in making the case to our board. They don't understand why this is such an important issue. They don't understand what could be done about it. And we need some political strategies to help us get our board on board so that we can move this issue forward. For other folks, it may be policy and strategy related. So there are communities out there who've adopted strategic plans to address integration, year by year plans that can be used as models for communities across the country. In terms of staff development, this is one I'm hearing about frequently, which is the need and the desire to hire a more diverse and inclusive teaching staff. And then once you have the staff in the building and in the district, what does a professional development look like in order to move folks to the next level? Fostering inclusion, this is probably the category where I get the most amount of questions. And we want to be clear. This is a program that focuses not just on the conditions for getting the kids in the building, but what happens once kids are in the building. And then, of course, there are school-specific strategies and housing-specific strategies that are going to be specific to what type of an organization you are. And we have partners who have experience in, for example, merging schools or using magnet schools as a draw for diversity. And so we look forward to seeing what the broad range of strengths are and represented in the applications, and picking a cohort that is able to leverage the strengths of all of its members. So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to pause it and take some questions. I want to say a couple quick words before I pass it to my colleague, Hallie Potter, who's actually been collecting the questions you've been posting. And she is going to read some of the questions that we think will be most pertinent to the broadest range of people. I do want to say, if we do not get to your question, please, please, please reach out. Feel free to email me directly. My email will be on the last slide, and it will be in the follow-up email that we send to you. Email us with any questions that you don't get to. I've listed some of the common topics for questions here in case it jogs anyone's thinking. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Hallie Potter, who is going to read us one question at a time, and I will do my very best to answer them. Hallie?
Great. So I have some questions that are from the chat box and also some that came in through the RSVPs. So one to start with relates to this question that you brought up, Stefan, about integrate desegregation and sort of what happens within school buildings. The question is, just because the population is diverse does not mean that its culture is integrated. In other words, students are represented proportionally throughout advanced courses, PTOs have equal parental input, etc. In fact, students of color can often face emotional and psychological violence in more diverse schools if the culture is not purposeful in its approach to help them thrive. So how will this initiative help schools not just diversify and integrate, but also dismantle white supremacy?
Well, first of all, I think that's a brilliant question. And one of the reasons why it resonates so personally with me is, as I shared a little bit at the beginning of this call, my own personal experience in public school bears that out. When you're the only Black student in an AP class, there are things that you have to deal with and things you have to think about all the time that may prevent you from taking full advantage of that. Not to mention, the problematic nature of the fact that you're the only African-American student in your AP class when there are tons of African-American students at your school. So the question resonates a lot with me. I think I'll go back to something I said earlier, which is at the core of this initiative is an understanding that integration does not just mean getting the right bodies in the building or getting the right bodies in the district. We actually think that might be the easier half of the battle to fight. And so many of the topics that we're going to be covering relate to this question that was posed. And this question that was posed covers a lot of different things. In order to achieve the things that were posed in the question, you need to start with staff, and you need to think about how staff are recruited and how staff are trained, which is a huge topic that we're going to get into. You need to think about curriculum and who's represented in the curriculum and what teachers' experience with the curriculum are, how they're able to teach the curriculum and relate to the curriculum, and students' experience with the curriculum. It gets to questions of inclusion and how you make people, students feel like they belong, like they have an equal voice at the table, like they can make decisions at the school level. And so it touches so many of the things that we know to be important, and some of the things that we will be working on, whether it's in consultancies or in sharing best practices and research over the course of the 2 years.
Great. We have another question that's come in about magnet schools and how that could fit in the picture of Bridges Collaborative. So can you talk about how magnet schools might come up in Bridges' work, and also address this question and clarify whether individual schools can apply?
Two great questions. Let me start with the second one just because it's easier. So individual schools that are standalone charter schools are eligible to apply. Individual schools that are part of a broader district are asked to apply as part of that district. Now, if there are major obstacles to that, I'd ask you to reach out to me personally and we can have a conversation. But individual schools as part of a broader school district or a part of a broader CMO are asked to apply as part of that broader organization. So to the other question around magnet schools in particular. So one of the things that we're really hoping to do at Bridges is we're hoping that through exposure to districts that have experience doing things that work in relation to school diversity and integration, that we are able to share that knowledge, that tangible, on the ground, practical knowledge and the tactical knowledge of how you exactly do that for organizations throughout the country. And so magnets falls into this category of potential solutions. There's not a one size fits all. And what we really want to do is we want to meet partners where they are. And magnets are one potential solution that might make sense in some geographic locations across the United States, but might not make sense for all of them. And so magnets, like so many of the other potential solutions, whether it's redrawing district boundaries, whether it's rethinking enrollment practices, whether it's thinking where new schools are sited, whether it's any number of potential solutions, magnet schools are one example. And we will have partner organizations, members in the cohort who have a lot of experience with magnet schools and can tell us best practices around the things that they've learned, the things that have gone really well, the things that have drawn parents, so that other folks can then learn from those experiences and adapt it to their own local context. And so I'm excited to see which organizations we end up taking in the collaborative of the many across the country that have used magnet schools as a tool to further school diversity and integration.
Following up on that theme, we have a question from a district that I think has some specific. You can also talk about some of the points that other might also be wondering about. So this question says, our school district is a top 5 largest school district in the country, and therefore it is unlikely that our superintendent will be able to physically participate on the collaborative. I work in the magnet schools department, whose mission it is to provide equitable access to rigorous, high quality, high interest learning opportunities and to create diverse and integrated environments. Would a team from our office be acceptable to represent our district?
I think that is a fantastic question, and we have examples of this across the country. And we're getting interest in applications from some of the largest school districts in the country. So your district will not be alone. And absolutely, and I think I made a nod to this earlier. If you're a top 20 district, you're serving over 100,000 students in your school district. It is not realistic to think that the superintendent will be able to take time out of his or her day to be able to attend all of the, hopefully we can bring them into some of our programming, but to attend all of the things that we have. And so exactly who is on your team, we leave to you within those parameters that I established. And the asterisk by the first parameter is that for some of the largest organizations in the country, it is acceptable to designate someone who is in the senior leadership team. So that is a C-suite person. So in relation to the magnet schools office question, if there is a representative on the senior cabinet who's in that office, or perhaps who that person reports to, that is the designee we would ask to be as part of the Bridges Collaborative. And then you can offer just a brief rationale in the application for who you've selected. And then the second thing that I'll say is, it's also not uncommon. There are districts around the country who most of their efforts in relation to school diversity integration either happen out of a magnet schools office, or they happen out of an office of innovation or an office of enrollment. And so it makes sense that the majority of the activity would take place there. And we expect for that district to apply with a hub in that office. But we also encourage folks to make sure that this effort is sustainable and that folks outside of that office know about the initiative as well. We ask folks to think expansively, not just exclusively use only members from one office. But again, we'd love to talk this over with you before you submit an application. So feel free to reach out to me anytime in the next few weeks.
Great. We have a couple of questions here specifically about putting together. One, is it one application per partner or per partnership in terms of the teams that are coming? And then also a question about putting together the team, a question about, can you include someone who's not from your organization? And are there any guidelines around including someone? Do you have to include someone who works in housing if you're in housing, or can you cross into other areas if it's someone who works in a related field?
These are fantastic questions. So for the first question, we're not going to make you fill out 5 applications, I promise. 1 application per organization. And what you'll find when you open the application is there'll be a place for you to list who the 5 folks you've designated as part of this team are and what their role is. So you're just going to make sure that you coordinate within your district or within your charter school or within your housing organization, coordinate to ensure that there's just 1 application coming to the Bridges Collaborative and that one person is filling it out. And some of the questions are in depth, so it might make sense for the team to do some brainstorming, maybe hop on a collective call beforehand, do some brainstorming together, and maybe share around the draft application. But we're only looking for 1 application per organization. To the second part of that question, around the composition of the team, another really good question. One of the things we're giving a lot of latitude around who the other 3 members of the team are. So there's tight parameters around members 1 and 2, but really it can be someone outside of your organization if you choose. That is up to you. Oftentimes folks have advocates, whether it's parent advocates, student advocates, folks who aren't full-time employees of the school district who are valuable to this conversation, who they want to bring into the fold, or nonprofit partners, or even potentially, if you're a school district, a housing organization you've been working with, or if you're a housing organization, a school district you've been working with. The other thing I will add is one of the things we're hoping to do is see applications from a range of partners within a given geographic region. So before an organization, say a school district, decides to just include 1 member from a local housing organization, it is worth talking to that organization about the Bridges Collaborative and encouraging them to submit their own application, because in an ideal world, we'd have 2 mini teams from each of those organizations in the same community, in the same city, both applying to the collaborative. And we think that the learning could be tremendously powerful in cases where that's possible.
Great. We also had a question come in about the role that foundations can play to support or participate in Bridges, and specifically about local community foundations.
Fantastic. Well, I actually think local community foundations often have some of the most intimate knowledge of the community and of all the different players that are needed to sit around the table. And so I really welcome the participation of local family or local foundations. What I would say is it might be best to reach out to us in order to do some level of collaboration and coordination about who might be applying from a given region. And there are absolutely ways for foundations to get involved, be it through potential regional collaborations that we may be doing, or even just helping us identify the right actors to be at the table. And we could supplement some of the regular activities that we do as a national cohort on a regional basis with the support of local foundations. So I absolutely welcome their involvement, and I think reaching out to us would be the best next step.
Great. We also had a question about, does it matter who fills out the application, and how long do you anticipate that actual application completion process to take?
Another great question. Boy, Hallie, I'm on the hot seat here. You keep peppering me with questions. So this is another good one. We, we took the time to fill out the application, and what we actually did was we then went back and cut it back even further because we really want to make sure that our folks in the field, our practitioner friends who are dealing with so many crises, and in particular COVID right now, and thinking about reopening, that this is not yet another burden placed upon them. So we really think that the application can be done in 1 to 2 hours. I will say it will probably be beneficial for, again, a small group of people to at least brainstorm some of the thinking and some of the answers to the questions in advance of submitting an application. So that may take a little bit more time if you add that, if you count that time. But we really want to make sure that folks that folks are able to complete all of the other things that they need to do. And a quick note on that, we are very well aware of the context in which we are launching this. And so our expectations of our participants and even the programming that we offer is going to be heavily influenced by making sure that whatever it is we do is most useful to our members. And so it will clearly be influenced by COVID and reopening and thoughts around those things as well, while sticking very true to our mission of making sure there are more seats in this country for students in diverse, integrated, rigorous, and inclusive environments. For the overall timeline, the application is due in early August. We're hoping to spend the month of August reviewing those applications and letting folks know in early September about their status. And then again, in mid-October, we're going to have our initial convening, which is going to be a virtual affair.
Question about whether there will be another cohort in the future.
So another great question. We certainly hope there will be, and we have support and funding to launch this initial 2-year cohort, and we have a lot of people across the country who are very excited about it. So I think based on the degree, the level of support and the level of interest, there's very likely to be future cohorts, but a lot of that is going to depend on financial support to be able to execute those and execute the very highest level of programming for our members. So while there are no guarantees, we're very hopeful and we're optimistic, and we think we'll be able to continue the work in the future, and particularly in light of all the interest across the country.
I think we're right at time, but someone has asked to see the first slide before we end. So I wonder if it's possible to end with that up.
Sure.
As
I
our,
will.
and also if you can address people having a chance to look back if they need to.
Absolutely. So here's what I'm going to do. There's one more slide I wanted to go over with folks, and then I will go back to the first slide to end on, which has our contact information. So on that note, thank you so much for all of your questions. Great questions. And if we didn't get to something that's important to you, please reach out to us. So a couple of other things I wanted to quickly address before we adjourn here. For folks who are interested in just general resources around thinking about diversifying schools and integrating classrooms, we have toolkits available on the TCF website. So be sure to visit us at tcf.org. You'll be able to click on the banner education, and from there it'll lead you to some of the toolkits and fact sheets that we've referenced throughout the presentation. For resources specifically on the Bridges Collaborative, you can go to the Bridges Collaborative website, which is part of the tcf.org website. There you'll find a one-pager of frequently asked questions. So your question may be there. Feel free to look at that before shooting us questions. And then finally, I mentioned this at the beginning, there are other ways to engage. So if you don't fit into one of these categories, we are engaging with many institutional partners who will be a part of this collaborative in different ways, whether it is folks who have expertise in something in particular who are going to be institutional partners for some of our convenings and offering some of the content, helping us to facilitate, whether it is folks, individuals who aren't part of an organization who want to volunteer or support in other ways, or even who want to be able to attend some of the programming. We won't be able to make all of the programming available to folks who are not in the cohort. In fact, most of it will be specific to members who've been accepted, but there will be occasions where we have events or we have trainings that are going to be open to the broader public. And so we encourage folks, if you fall in that category, to either reach out to us directly or make sure on the Bridges Collaborative website that you sign up to receive updates from the Bridges Collaborative, and you'll get regular emails about the things that we're up to and ways that you can plug in. Finally, remember that the application is due Friday, August 7th at midnight Pacific time. We're looking forward to seeing your application. We're so excited. We've already gotten applications in, and we've heard from folks across the country. So we're really excited to see what comes in. If we can be supportive between now and then, reach out to us and let us know. And then I was asked to go back to the very first slide. So this is the first slide. It does not have our contact information on there, but we'll put that in the chat. And as I said, anybody who is a participant after this webinar, you are going to get an email with all of the relevant information. That's it for us. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.